Tara Quinn. So we are very pleased to introduce her. So she's an environmental social scientist, and she did her PhD at the University of East Anglia, I guess 2 years ago, 3 years? Yeah, 2 years ago. And she's interested, so now she's presently a research fellow at the University of Exeter, and she's interested in how people think or perceive or think or interpret environmental risk and how they adapt to this risk. And she is involved with us as part of the MAGIC project, the international project that is funded by Belmont Forum, and that is focused on the coastal area management in Cornwall. So it's the case study of Tara, and also on the Montpellier region for the French team that is led by IRSTEA and CIRAD and CNRS. And also we have a third case study, a place where that is located in South Africa. It's the Garden Route. The MAGIC project explores how adaptation to global change or to climate change, more specifically, takes place at different scales, and how we deal or not with vulnerability transfer, as François said earlier. So thank you, Tara, for sharing with us your work and ideas in this peculiar day, because it's after the Brexit and it's the day of Trump election, so you will remember this day in your professional career. And but we expect also nice answers to specific questions of the audience. So you will present to us you will explore the role of place attachment in experience of risk, and you will draw some lessons from 2 English case studies. So thank you, Tara, again to be with us, and I give you the floor.
My research that I'm going to talk about is actually more focused on risk and how place attachment can help us to understand how different people experience risk. And I like the phrase that Patrick touched upon, that place attachment is a way of seeing. Because the research that I've carried out, the findings from it suggest that using a lens of place attachment allows you to understand from a slightly different angle why people perceive some things to be risky and others not to be. So I'm going to talk briefly about place attachment and how it's related to risk, some of the theory. And then I'm going to discuss two empirical studies that I've been involved in. So the first one is actually from my PhD work. I've revisited it recently, and that's a small qualitative in-depth study with older adults and how they experience flood risk. And the second one is the one that Raphael referenced. It's the MAGIC project that I currently work on with a number of colleagues here in the room. And for that project, we're going to zoom back out. We're interested in how wider social processes, such as mobility and environmental change, interact to perform to create certain configurations of risk, and how place attachment may help us to understand that. So risk, which seems also an appropriate thing to be talking about on a day like today. Risk is essentially uncertainty, but something is only a risk to you if it is uncertainty about something that you value. Uncertainty that affects something that you don't value isn't actually necessarily a risk for you. So immediately for me, that speaks to place attachment and the symbolic meaning that people attach to places. So we attach meaning to different aspects of places, and it's only when those specific meanings are threatened that we actually then actively become aware or register certain risks. We do know, and this is work that I've been involved in the last 5 years, that people don't always seem to act rationally in the face of flood risk. And I'll go on to, I put rationally in apostrophe there because actually maybe it is rational when you take into consideration social and psychological processes. Risk research, it's a very rich body of research going back, well, the largest part of it over the last 50 years. And a lot of the risk research and decision-making about risk divides the decision-making processes into analytical and logical processes that take a bit of time and quite a lot of energy. It's more about statistics and probabilities. These are the processes that policymakers and insurance companies might be more likely to draw on, where they're trying to understand why people make decisions around risk. And then emotional aspects of decision-making. So it's a bit like the thinking fast and slow that's become quite popular in America. The emotional aspects are the more intuitive decisions that we make around risk. So they're often quite quick. That maybe sometimes they're located in that reptilian part of our brain that helped to keep us safe when we were trying to stay away from nasty animals. And now we use them for different decision-making processes. These two decision-making processes aren't independent of each other. They often speak to each other. But I think in particular, I think place attachment and place attachment theory can really help us to understand some of the emotional processes that underpin the decisions that people make around risk. So, place and risk. If you value emotional processing, the evidence from emotional processing of risk has suggested that when you value something, you're more likely to cognitively reduce the risk associated with it. So if you value a person or a place or an item, in order for you to continue living happily on a day-to-day basis, you then manage cognitively any risk associated with it, and you also amplify the benefits associated with it. And then when we turn to place theory, when we're trying to understand how place, and Patrick touched on very briefly place identity, when we're trying to understand how place contributes to well-being, continuity of place is something that's re-emerged time and time again from some of the research carried out by environmental psychologists, but also by sociologists and anthropologists. And this is because the relationship that's often highlighted is that continuity of place is important because place forms part of our self-identity. So the places that we've lived in the past, that we currently live in at the moment, places that are of national symbolic importance, form part of our self-concept. And in terms of well-being, continuity and stability of our self-concept is something that we strive for on a day-to-day basis. And so we like places that are important for our self-identity to remain the same or similar. And I think that speaks to some of the work that Patrick was talking about. We don't like things that challenge too much what a place means to us and the symbolic meaning we attach to the place. And in terms of the mechanisms that underpin how we relate to a place, actually, place research, the underlying mechanism, so how it is we do become attached to a place, is quite sparse. Some of the researchers have often alluded to Bowlby's theory of childhood attachment as explaining how we attach to a place. So Bowlby's theory of childhood attachment, it's developed actually alongside Mary Ainsworth in the 50s and 60s. And his work focused on understanding the relationship between children and their primary caregiver, so in the first 3 years of life. And what he found was that the security of that attachment was really important for a child's well-being in that moment in time and also going into the future. And so when researchers discuss the importance of place attachment for our well-being, they often refer to the Bowlby's work and suggest that actually maybe it's the same mechanisms that cause us to attach in certain ways to certain places. A nice piece of work that was carried out in the UK that touches on this theory is some work by Tim Harries, who works in London on flood risk 2. And the title of his paper was Feeling Secure versus Being Secure. And Tim Harries was interested in why people don't make changes to their houses when they know they're at high risk of flooding. So they've either been flooded or they've been told repeatedly that they're likely to be flooded in the relatively near future. And again, this seems like irrational behaviour if you're not someone who's living in one of those areas, because when you make these changes, you A, can try and prevent floodwater from entering, but B, you can make the recovery process a lot smoother. And also, you can actually also reduce your insurance premiums. So he went in and he carried out in-depth interviews with these residents. And what he found was that the representation of home that has been discussed in especially anthropological literature was really drawn into focus by the threat of a flood. So home as a safe place, as a haven, as somewhere that separates you from the outside world. You have particular behaviours that you only carry out at home, certain routines. And people were not willing to make changes to their homes that threaten that feeling of safety. So they weren't willing to put floodgates on their doors, permanent floodgates. They weren't willing to move the sockets up the wall. And they weren't willing, for example, to put tiles down because it reminded them on a daily basis that that place was no longer secure. And so actually what they were doing, if you reframe it slightly, is they were trading off their daily well-being against this possible negative impact in the future. And for me, then actually that becomes quite a rational decision. And I think it's a really nice piece of work as well. So the first empirical study I'm going to talk about is work that I did for my PhD. It's work that I've revisited recently, and it's about the importance of place for older adults and what it means for managing flood risk. And largely I'm going to talk about the importance of home and house, actually, in terms of scale. So for my PhD thesis, I did my work in northwest England in a place called the Lake District. It's a very beautiful area, as you can see. It's a hilly area. Lots of people go there for hiking holidays. Lots of people retire there too. And it's an area that has a strong association with flood risk. So over the last 20 years, there's been significant flood events, maybe every 3 to 4 years. So it's a risk that people do really have to live with. And for my PhD work, I carried out, I did it in 2 sites, but in one, in the Lake District, I carried out about 200 surveys. And as I was carrying out these surveys, I was struck by the fact that a lot of the people who were impacted were older adults. And that was just as I was doing the door knocking. There was about 1,000 households that were directly impacted across a few towns. And so I went and checked the statistics with the local authority, and what I found out from the people who worked there was that 63% of those who'd been flooded were older adults, but they only actually made up 17% of the population. Okay, that's interesting. There's a bit of a retirement area, maybe, as I kept doing my service and I kept having informal conversations with people alongside that. And I asked them, why do you live in this part of town? And a lot of the residents that I spoke to, especially, and I should say older adults in the UK, the definition is over 65, so it's retirement age. But that definition will change depending on the country that you're in. The people that I spoke to told me, oh, well, we moved here, but because we want to be able to get into town quite easily, we wanted to live somewhere that's quite flat. And we also want to live somewhere that's close to town so that we can still keep going in and doing performing activities that we've always performed. In the Lake District, in a hilly area like the Lake District, flat areas close to the town tend to be alongside rivers, or they tend to be alongside lake shores. So already you're seeing this place-dependent aspect of how people relate to their place. So place-dependence is a term that's used in environmental psychology to describe people's instrumental relation with place. So it's how they can achieve certain activities, maybe it's exercise or access to roads, access to jobs. It's not really underpinned by emotional bonds, it's more of a practical relationship. So that was quite interesting. I thought, okay, I had a bit of time, so I actually decided to go and conduct some in-depth interviews with older adults. I wanted to really understand how they experienced the floods and how they felt about potential future flood risk. So I carried out these interviews and I went back to the gerontological literature, so that's the literature on ageing. And there's a really rich vein of research in the gerontological literature that discusses how home becomes increasingly important as you become older. And I know not all older adults are the same. There is a lot of heterogeneity, but especially as you get into your later years and you become less physically able to go out and about and perform certain activities, the importance of your home as part of your identity really increases. In terms, you spend a lot more of your daily life within the limits of your home, so from a time perspective. But in terms of feelings of self-reliance and mastery, actually your home, negotiating your home and your home remaining the same becomes a lot more important. So where the table is, where the chair is. You want those things to remain the same because you want to be able to perform all the activities that you're used to performing. Where the toaster, where the plates are, you have them in particular places, and it's really important for your well-being that those things remain within your control. They can change, but that they remain within your control. So I conducted these interviews, and I spoke to 14 people, so it was a small sample, but this was a town where only a small number of people had been flooded. And I found that experience of place was shaped by flooding, but this also shaped the interviewees' self-perceived capacity to adapt to future flood risk. So I conducted the interviews, I transcribed them, coded them, and these were the themes that emerged from my analysis. So you can see here there's 4 overarching themes. I'm just going to scoot over them. I talk about place attachment and place dependence, which was that functional health aspect I talked about in terms of living in flat places near to the centre of town. The importance of social networks, as Patrick said, place is not just about physical places, it's also about the people that you know in them. And then the last 2, which I'll talk about in more detail, is the physical limitations when dealing with floods and flood risk, and also the inoculation effect. I'm not going to read these out, you can just read them over my shoulder, but these are 2 extracts from interviews that I carried out, and these 2 extracts focus on how the meaning of home changed for these individuals after the flood event. So the first lady, it was a lady in the quote above, discussed, and this was something that emerged actually quite commonly in the interviews if people didn't have close social networks in the town, was the lack of control that these people had about how their homes were managed after the flood events. When a flood event happens, or when in 2009 when this flood event happens, I spoke to them a few years later, you're either moved by people that you know or your family members to accommodation nearby, or you're moved by public authorities to rental accommodation. And for some of these people who didn't have someone they could rely on in managing what happened in their home, restoration companies would go in, and once you've been flooded, once water's entered your sofas and it's gotten into the wood and all the different items in your home, actually it's pretty much almost impossible to get them back to the state that they were in before. But these people found that when they returned home that lots of things had been thrown out without them being meaningfully consulted, and they weren't always happy with what had been established in their place. And what I found from this is that now when they're back in their homes, they're very much more aware of the transient nature of what home is. Home no longer felt safe for them. It didn't feel secure anymore. And because they hadn't had a say in how the house had been re-established, or they hadn't had a significant say in how their home had been re-established, they felt this slight disconnection, but it was having a real impact on their sense of their own ability to cope with future flood risk. The second example is an extract from a lady that I spoke to who'd had a really terrible time during the floods. She'd had lots of things happen alongside the flood event that had really taken its toll on her. But when we talked about, and she lived in a house, she didn't actually live in the town, she lived just about a field away, and she lived in a lovely house, 2 stories. And she said when the floods were coming, it was just like a tidal wave where she was, but she was very isolated. There wasn't neighbours to call on. And so in England, when you live in a flood risk area, you get flood warnings. And this happens if you live somewhere, there is a problem about people getting normalised to flood warnings. But this lady had become more sensitised to flood warnings because she was very concerned about her ability to negotiate her home. So she was very concerned about her dog and not being able to move her dog. Her dog was elderly, she wasn't able to move her dog up the stairs. And she was also concerned with the fact that even though they'd installed a pump to help with trying to keep floodwaters at a reasonable level, she wasn't able to actually physically take it out and use it. So the flood event had made her very aware of her own physical inability to live in a self-reliant way in her home, and that subsequently was having an impact on her own perceived capacity to deal with future flood risk. So it was very interwoven with how she negotiated her home and her house. Conversely, about half of the adults, older adults that I spoke to, demonstrated in some shape or form something called the inoculation effect. So in psychological research, the inoculation effect describes when you've experienced a negative event in the past, and because of that, you're better able to deal with future events. They don't have to be the same events, but it gives you a sense of ability to be able to deal with them. And this was actually something that was relatively common in the people that I spoke to. And place identity seemed to play a big part in this. So the first quote describes previous flood events. So this person was able, because of their longer life experience, they're able to place the most recent flood event against a longer narrative of other distressing events that happened in the past. And they're also able to play out and discuss their intimate knowledge of the local town and how people had dealt with things in the past. And the second quote talks more explicitly about local, or displays local knowledge and the importance of feeling that this person was quite eager to discuss how they knew the town very well, how they're very aware of the threat of flood risk, how they're aware of where flooding had happened in the past. And so they were these people I found were the people who had or displayed this inoculation effect were very eager to place this experience against this wider and longer narrative. And you could see, and when you discuss future flood events and you ask, well, you know, how do you feel about the potential for those, they actually felt better able to cope with flood events. And they were a lot less sensitive to things like flood warnings. It didn't concern them so much. They felt that if a flood event happened, it would just be another story and another event in their life, and the meaning they attach to their local town, and that they would be able to deal with it. So the implications from this small study was that flood experience does change place meaning, which that conforms with other work. For the adults in the first slide, it had made home, it undermined the feeling of security in home. And it made people more sensitive and more anxious about certain aspects of risk. So I think if you went into a household that was a younger family or independent professionals, the aspect of risk that they'd be concerned about would be a bit different because of the way that they relate to their home and the meaning that their home has to them. So the construction of risk is slightly different depending on, I haven't carried out that work, but it seemed to be very particular to people's physical ability to be able to negotiate their homes. A specific recommendation coming out of this work was that we need to take special care with how housing clearances are dealt with after flood events. That people who are no longer in their homes and aren't physically able to be on site are meaningfully and thoroughly consulted when insurance companies and restoration crews go in to manage the impacts of a flood. And the final implication, and it tallies with some work done in New Zealand, is the importance of giving older adults spaces to tell their stories after distressing events, because it can increase a feeling of self-reliance and self-mastery that they don't often get a chance to share with their local community. And this is just in conversation with local public health workers, this was something they were very keen on doing. The second empirical study that I'm going to talk about is the MAGIC project. It's the project that I'm currently involved in. For this project, like I said, I'm going to take it, the scale is slightly larger, and what we're interested in our little subgroup in MAGIC is how mobility patterns are shaping the populations within certain settlements, how this may be affecting how place attachment is configured in these settlements, and what this may mean for risk perception and social differentiation of risk. So if you move to towns, so this builds on the work that, or speaks to the work that Patrick's talking about. If you have different types of place attachments, place relative, active, what does this mean for how you experience risk? Because if you value different things about your town, does that mean that you perceive risk differently? So for our study, we have collected data in the 3 sites, the Garden Route in South Africa, Languedoc here in southern France, and Cornwall, England, which is where I carried out my fieldwork. In France, our French team members carried out surveys in 2 towns, Lats and Sommières, which I'll speak about soon. And the processes of mobility in these regions are slightly different, and they're causing configurations of populations to change slightly. In Cornwall and in South Africa, there's quite similar processes going on, because both are quite similar regions. They're very beautiful. They're not really that close to centres of industry. So people are moving there for lifestyle reasons or to retire. So either you want a different pace of life away from busy settlements, or you want to retire somewhere beautiful. And so you've got people moving in and changing the demography of the town. So the town that I work in, Wadebridge, you actually can see a distinct change in house prices, because the people moving in tend to be quite wealthy. And so we're interested in whether these people experience their attachment to place differently. In the Languedoc, just to touch on it quickly, is from what I understand, you have also people moving here for the Mediterranean lifestyle, but you also have people moving here because it's an area that's been identified for growth. So people are also moving here for jobs as well. As I said, we want to try and understand how these different groups relate to their places, and we want to try and explore whether they experience risk differently because of this. So we stratified our sample in the 4 sites. We spoke to people who lived in exposed areas. It was householders that we spoke to, and we're interested in individual interpretations of place. And we stratified our sample, so we spoke to people who were exposed and those who weren't directly exposed. They lived in the town boundaries, but they didn't live on the floodplain. And we did this because place attachment is not the only variable that shapes perceptions of risk. One of the most commonly discussed and explored variables is previous experience of risk. And that we wanted to control for that in our study. So in France, they conducted an extensive pilot study last year in Lats and Sommières. These are 2 towns that have experienced floods in the relatively recent past, but they have quite different approaches to flood risk management. In Lats, there's quite a strong system of dikes, and the narrative from local authorities is that this is a safe place to live. When I went to Sommières, I saw in the streets little signs that indicated previous flood levels, and it was an area it's a town that seemed to be more au fait with the fact that flooding may happen. People weren't distanced too much from the fact that a flood had happened in the past. And we used the different types of place attachment that Patrick was discussing in the second study. We used a quantitative method to try and capture those. So we used a traditional place scale, I should say ones that have been used in the past that are unidimensional. And then we used the different attachment types that Patrick discussed. However, the 3 non-attached types we did collapse into one, just because of the number of variables that would have to be included on a survey. And this was the output, and it's a bit complicated to look at, but because of the number of the surveys that were conducted in the pilot study, we couldn't do statistical testing. So we just wanted to check really that that the issues that we were interested in researching did actually play out in this pilot sample. So here you can see a multi-correspondence analysis linking place attachment variables, so place discovered, place traditional, place relative, also with categorical variables that were about why people moved to the town that they moved to. And the final one was perceptions of risk. So we plugged these into multi-correspondence analysis. And the small circle represents the response from Lats, and the larger one is the response from Sommières. So there was more variation in the response from Sommières than there was from the response from Lats. And from this analysis of the pilot work, what we found was that people moved to Lats and Sommières for different reasons. Lats, people moved there for facilities, and Sommières, people moved there predominantly for the environment. They also have different types of place attachment are dominant in the 2 towns. So in Sommières, I can flick back to this if it's helpful. In Sommières, the predominant type of place attachment is place relative. So it's not underpinned by an emotional relationship with the town. It's more about, well, the meaning, the facilities that it provides. But in Sommières, the type of attachment was active, the predominant attachment. So people moved there because it represented something about themselves that they wanted to relate to in the place that they lived in. And interestingly, what we found was that active attachment in Sommières did correlate with perception of risk at the city scale. So from this initial analysis, we've collected our data. This data collection is still ongoing in South Africa, it's of slightly different time frames. And I've been here for a couple of weeks working with Francois on looking at the outcomes of our research data collection. And I've just got here some initial descriptive results because we haven't launched into the statistical modelling yet. So you can just see here on the left is the reasons that people move to the town that they are currently living in. So Sommières and Latz are the two towns here in France, and Wadebridge is England. And you can see there's a bit of variation between the three towns. So yeah, I'll move, and then on the right is actually, this one's more of a stark result. This is a graph reflecting the meanings that people attach to the water bodies in the area, so either the rivers or the sea. And as we framed it in our survey, it was the water bodies that also form a threat in terms of flood risk. And you can see in Latz that the predominant, or actually 100% of respondents described the river Les flowing alongside Latz geographically. And when we say geographically, we just mean that when we asked about the meaning of the water body, they use words like, it's a river, it flows to the sea, it's to the south of the town. So there was no embellishing on that, and there was no emotional words attached to it. Whereas, well, negative was when there was references to the floods and to the unknowability of the rivers. Relational was when people actively used emotive words to describe it. And positive service was it was a code that related to when people use it for recreational activities or for particular social events. And neutral was when people just said, oh, it's okay, it's fine. It wasn't even geographical, it was a bit of a non-answer. And what we're interested in doing is using those place attachment modalities that Patrick talked about, but also using these different types of place meaning to understand how the different groups that have moved to towns relate to that town. And then we want to test it against different aspects of how people experience risk. So whether they think they're exposed, whether they think they're at risk at different scales in their home, in their neighbourhood and in their town, whether they think they're vulnerable. We really want to get a clear picture as to whether wider mobility patterns are contributing to a social differentiation of risk, and whether this is connected to place attachment and processes of place attachment. So in conclusion, from the work that I've been involved in, it is clear to me that the way that people relate to their houses and to their local places shapes how they experience risk. And I don't mean it's just about whether they think a place is risky or whether they think it's 50% at risk. I mean also what element it is of a place in their home that they're worried about, because that has implications for how they manage risk as well. And I think it's important for us to use this different way of seeing to try and understand how we may be able to better manage risk for some of these groups. What is rational depends on how you frame the issue. From an economic perspective, some of these decisions may seem irrational. From a well-being or psychological perspective, they start to seem a little bit more rational. And I think this has implications for how we communicate risk with different groups as well. To be more fully explored, we have indications that different social groups experience risk differently, and this reflects other research too. We want to try and really unpack that with the data that we have from our surveys. And going forward, I'm interested in understanding how changes in mobility patterns may be shaping wider risk landscapes, and also how is place experienced differently through life and during significant life events. So risks don't happen in isolation. There's often other things happening in your life, and what does this mean for how you experience place and how you experience risk? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this talk. It's really very interesting. I'm working myself on flood risk in the south of France. So it's true that very often the place attachment seems to be a very important reason for people to accept staying in a risky place and being flooded. I have two questions. One was not completely clear to me whether in the second study you look at place attachment at the community level, so at the municipality level only, or also on attachment to home. So one question. And the other one is there's a very huge difference. You talked a little bit about it, but I'm not sure whether you took it into account in your analysis about between Lat and Sommières, because Sommières is very frequently flooded and people have a lot of past experience of flood risks, and Lat not. And so experience is really one major reason for risk perceptions and also for what people do to protect themselves. So what is exactly the link you make between the experience and then the place attachment and the risk perceptions that you measure?
Yeah. So with regards to experience, as I said, we stratified our sample, and because we realised from the risk research that experience does explain a lot of variation in people's perceptions of risk, and especially flood risk. So in effect, we control for that in the way that we sampled, but also we asked questions in the survey about how the last flood that you experienced and where you experienced it. So we'll control for our analysis, we'll control for experience as a variable, and then whether place explains variations beyond that. So
there's nearly no experience on that.
They were flooded in, was it 2002?
2002,
yeah.
Very few compared to some.
Less, but still you have people who have the experience. And then if you talk to people in Sommières, they experience frequently some small ones. But at the same time, in 2002, there was a very, very big one. So they refer to that. So it's not the same amplitude, the same size of flood, but both of the two groups, they have a reference to 2002 or 2003.
And I think that again, that's why we did sample in such a way. So even if people haven't experienced a flood, we will control for that in our analysis. So, but it is a very valid point, and I think it will be interesting to see how much variation place attachment can explain beyond that. And your first question, which was about whether we captured place at different scales, are the scales that were related to Patrick's work were at the town level, but we also asked people qualitative questions about what their homes meant to them, which we've coded, so we use that as a categorical variable. We asked about we asked single item questions about attachment to your house, to your neighbourhood, and to your city, or town as we would say in England. So we have captured at different scales, different attachments. Some of them are Likert scales and others are qualitative categorical variables that we'll use.
But the graph you showed, it was about attachment
to the town, yeah. Oh, sorry, the one on the left was to the town, the right was to the water body in the area. And that wasn't about attachment, it was about meaning. Sorry if I didn't make that clear. It was about what the water body in rivers or sea meant to the person. That's okay.
Okay.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. That was nice to see a presentation from somebody else from the team about this project. I have a question to both of you actually, because on the way you look at the place attachment, because each time you're considering a typology that seems to be exclusive, meaning that there is you can only have one type of attachment, and I'm wondering. It questioned me because for me the place attachment can be of a very different nature, and it can be very positive on some aspect of the place and very negative on the other. So how do you and the way you relate that to a change in the environment or a risk can be completely different according to what type of attachment and you are actually considering. So how do you deal with that? And is it a simplification that is necessary to actually get something out from your study, or did you? Is it actually a limit that you encounter in your studies? And so yeah, that's. I'm hoping to be clear.
Yeah.
But sure.
Well, I mean, I think I'd start by saying that the original idea of these different dimensions came from a Polish researcher who used a quantitative method, like a cluster analysis. So it forced people into different groups. But when we were doing the research in the UK using a qualitative method, my researcher, Etienne, he gave people the opportunity to choose for themselves which ones of these characteristic labels they think might apply to themselves. And we found that for most people in the sample, it was not a difficult task, and they were able to choose the one which they felt was most appropriate for them. But for some people, they were not able to make a clean distinction, because they felt that they were a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And those people were the people who had lived there in their childhood and had moved away and had returned. And they found that they were not able to say that they were exclusively traditional or exclusively attached, that in some ways they were a hybrid of the two. So that gives some empirical suggestion that actually the boundaries between the types are, of course, not that clear. And certainly for those two, there will be people who will not fall into a neat category because of their life experience to date. And of course, as we're saying, life experiences don't stay static, places change, people change, so it is very unlikely that people will stay in one position over time, depending on how their life circumstances or the place changes around them. So I do think that the typologies are useful in the beginning of a research area, I think, to lay out some territory and terrain. But they are quite crude, especially at the boundaries of each of the types. So I'm not surprised in a way that there will be fuzzy boundaries and distinctions, and that the research will eventually show that more and more, particularly when it looks at change over time and how that works out.
We did find actually, we discussed this briefly at the break, that when we've done some initial analysis, but it's not complete enough really to present, that when we ran a factor analysis on the scale for the most recent types of modalities, they didn't cluster in the same way that they had in the study that we based it on. And I was discussing with Patrick, I think you then want to go with the context. If you have these different items, and if they cluster differently, then what you essentially have is a slightly different type of attachment to place. And so it's that tension between comparability between other studies, but also honouring the context that you're working in. But I think what would be useful, I think qualitatively, you have maybe a bit more room when you're analysing interviews to come up with quite specific delineations between categories. I think for place, and I think we really discovered this when we're having discussions about what questions to use in our surveys, because some of them just didn't work in different contexts. And I think it will be the move forward, or the development that will be quite useful, will be coming up with a set of questions that then can be used to generate different types of attachment that are appropriate to different contexts.
Yes, for example, the Polish researcher who created the original typology had an item for traditional attachment, which was describing the local place as a place where the graves of our ancestors are buried. And we put this survey in a survey in the UK, and nobody really, sorry. I think there is, certainly when you want to quantitatively measure these different relationships with place, there are issues with our current best practice, and some of the things that work in Poland certainly do not work in the UK in the same way. So that doesn't surprise me at all in terms of you know, how maybe certain kinds of things are more strong in certain places, and that's not necessarily a problem with the questionnaire necessarily, but it's something which is actually of interest then in showing contextual differences in how relationships work out. The only other thing I thought about saying is that some people in the place attachment literature distinguish between attachment to the community, essentially, and attachment to the physical environment in the area. And these types don't make that really very clear, but they probably overlook complexities of the dynamics between whether it is the countryside around the town that you're really very strongly attached to, or the neighbours on your street, or a combination of the two. And of course those things are always changing over time as well. So if you find it difficult to, if circumstances change and you lose your friendships, then that certainly might weaken your attachment or turn it from strong attachment to relativity. You can imagine that happening. So I think those things have not really been researched properly yet, but will come out at some point, I think, when we do that.
François, you want to?
Yeah, I want to participate, and as someone working with Tara on the case of LAT and on magics, it's also to say that we complement these studies, the quantitative one with, as Tara said, with qualitative ones, and how much the analysis also, the quantitative analysis goes with historical analysis, socio-historical analysis. We analyze the way the towns, the community perceives themselves, the discourse they have. And out of the quantitative and the qualitative work, we come with a consistent or not narrative, which explains more. For instance, a story for the French case study, a story of living with the risk in Sommières, and that has really is put forward. That while in LAT you have a story of control of the risk. So you look to the data also to see this consistency and sometimes inconsistency. For instance, in LAT, where they have really this discourse of control, that people are protected and so on. When we ask people what are the main risks, then flood comes at 80%. So it's interesting to compare the two stories, the qualitative and the quantitative ones.
Any more question? We can open, if you wish, a more general discussion about this topic and the way to address it, and maybe just to start some elements. My question could be, both of you you address, you focus on the relationship between people or individuals or social groups to a specific place, whatever the scale is. And but what about their own relationship to decision making and process? And how do you link these two components in your work, especially in the context of risk management and land planning and the issue of the engagement of stakeholders? Could be that. Another point is you focus in the first talk on the essentialization process, and I was just wondering what connection do you do between this essentialization process and the patrimonialization we observe in the European landscape that we call now cultural landscape everywhere. And so I don't know if you know what I mean by patrimonialisation. So it's a French word, but it will be very soon famous in the English language. So patrimonialization is the process where you focus more on the natural or on cultural heritage, and you promote the identity of a specific place. And so the essentialization process you describe is part of it. So it's asking the question if place attachment and social crisis or social conflicts are very useful to build identity and to essentialize our relationship to place and to create identity. And we observe this maybe mostly this year, this last decade, with the patrimonialization process. Yes. Any other comments or could be part of it? Another comment, maybe, if you wish. In the literature, there is a specific literature that focuses on the value-action gap. Why? Basically, the question is why we don't do what we think or what we say that we will do. It's a political question too. And so with the NIMBY approach, you address the issue of the information deficit model that was part of this literature. And but what about the integration of? It's related to the question of Olivier earlier. What about how to discuss the place attachment and the values we give to the different components of the place and the different types of relationships or dependencies or interdependencies, and how to discuss with the different social groups, and how to build collectively the what we call the general interest. Or so what kind how your findings can feed all the discussion about dialogue processes and participatory approach related to environmental and regional planning or risk management or adaptation to global changes. Other comments or you so it's but also in the yes, I will give you.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, I think I'll separate those into two then, mainly. I think you asked about how you can build the general interest then, which maybe cuts across the different types of place attachment, perhaps. I mean, I suppose one thing is to focus on is to try and build a collective around the future of the place as being a positive one for everybody who lives there. And that might be a way of bringing together different kinds of people with the same ultimate common motive in mind, healthy living, social harmony, etc. That might be one way of doing it. It struck me that when I was listening to Tara's talk, you talked about giving older adults the opportunity to tell their own stories. And when you said that, it reminded me of the question we had earlier about how do you have participation, how do you bring certain kinds of people in. We know from the research now that the actively attached individuals will be more likely to participate and to make objections. And we were talking about the difficulty of reaching maybe some of the traditionally attached people. But I think if you have a participatory process which values local knowledge, then you are more likely to have spaces for people to tell their stories about the history of the place or the history of their experience in the place. And that, I think, is one important distinction between what normally happens in energy projects is that there is an information deficit assumption and there is an information provision consultation, which is a one-way process. We have exhibitions to tell you about our technology, and then you will know about our technology and you'll accept it. Whereas if you're interested in local knowledge, then the development is an opportunity to listen to what local people have got to tell you about the past and the history of the place and their own histories in that place. So the mechanism is more about listening rather than speaking. And it is also based on a value of local knowledge. And that might be one way of making a more participatory dialogue. If people feel that there is a possibility that they will be listened to, if they think that is genuine and they overcome mistrust and skepticism about whether that is really the case, then maybe that is a way of building a more collective dialogue which can make that happen if you can pull that off. So I think it would be based on different values. It will probably use different methods, but it will need to overcome maybe any initial skepticism that that's really a genuine process. The other thing is it's very interesting to hear you talk about patrimonialization, because it's not something that I have specifically studied, but I'm aware of the fact that place meanings are not outside of our neoliberal economic context, and there is increasing competition between regions and towns and cities and places for inviting people in for tourism, inviting companies in for investment and employment, inviting workers in to work. And so there are deliberate attempts to create new place meanings, which to me raises then the issue of how legitimate they are and whether people feel that they are artificial or certainly normative, and how much the people who are creating the branding of that kind of patrimonialization are doing so with an attempt to bring the local population with them, or is it simply focused on the external audience who you are trying to attract? So there are some very interesting dynamics there that I would like to research, but I haven't done so in the past. But I think it certainly raises those questions about top-down place meanings versus bottom-up kind of generation of place meanings, and the politics of creating place and future places, and whether you have space for different kinds of stories there. Local indigenous people who have been there for a long time, as well as people who are trying to attract new economic activities and are trying to... I mean, I come back to the project I mentioned, which was about local mapping, and what was interesting about that was whether different communities were prepared to acknowledge some of the things in the local area that were not that positive, really, but were still part of the heritage. So an ugly building or an ugly infrastructure versus other communities that were simply trying to have a very kind of idealist view of the local area, maybe for a marketing point of view. So there is a little bit of an issue of authenticity here to some degree, and whether you choose to overlook certain events or certain parts of the environment which maybe are not pretty or beautiful or aesthetic but are still characterful, and that might be one way of lessening a sense that it is being imposed, or it's very much a kind of an artificial construction. You want to add?
You did ask about decision making and other processes that may shape decision making. In our work, our focus is on perception of risk, but then we do have subsequent questions in the surveys about what you would support as directions of managing flood risk. And what we've done is we've included, from previous flood research, items on social capital, items on where you think responsibility lies, to try and get a fuller picture of how the risk is constructed for those particular people. We haven't, put a variables in there for locus of control or things like that, but we've tried to control for as much as possible other processes that might shape why people support certain things and not others, and therefore we can be sure or not. We can be sure whether place attachment does impact on that end variable, or whether it doesn't explain it. So we have put some controlling variables in for that.
Actually, I had a. It's another question, but obviously some question hasn't been debated yet. So can I still add one in the pile, which is about the role of change in in your study and in the different type of attachment that you can have, bouncing on the discussion that we had during the break, but and also looking at the local attachment versus potentially the national or the global attachment. I remember a very interesting discussion with somebody from Japan who was saying that in Japan history, they were more looking at how their society adapt and always have this strength to actually adjust to changes, when in our old culture or Occidental culture, we are referring to the tradition, the stability, the past. So is it likely that, according to the context, the attachment will... You always refer to the fact that people are averse to change, or that they want the attachment is linked to the stability. And I'm actually wondering whether in some contexts, maybe the attachment can also be linked with adaptation and change, at least certain type of change. So as you are always looking at the link between the attachment, the kind of attachment, and some type of change, being a risk or being a settlement of something new, I'm just wondering whether, because your context were always in Occidental culture, you had a certain type of answer, and whether if you go in another culture, maybe the answer would be different.
Yeah, I think that's quite interesting. There's been work done not on place but on the differences between identity processes between East and West, and how people see themselves in their environments. You show a picture, I think it was in Japan, a photo of a tiger in a forest. In the West, we say it's a photo of a tiger, and when they showed it to a group of people in Japan, it was a forest scene. So I think there is this difference in how people perceive place and themselves in place. For me, it's not a stability that place never change, but it's a change that you are happy with, or it's change that you have maybe some element of control over. I think places do change and people are okay with that sometimes. But I think it's when there's a very much a lack of control, then that change becomes a significant issue. But Patrick edited a fantastic book a couple of years ago, and one of the chapters was
on place attachment.
Oh, it was on place attachment, but it talked about how, you know, for people like Macy. Place is always changing, so it just depends on the frame or your ontology, basically, about how you describe place. I think for environmental psychological research, you're capturing it in that moment in time and you're testing relationships, but you're not assuming that 5 years later that those types of attachments will be the same in that town. So it's almost testing the relationships between them rather than the change, if that makes sense.
I generally agree with what Tara's just said, that I don't think there's, sorry, that I don't think any of the types of relationship to place are rooted in a view of the place as not changing necessarily. It's more depends on the kind of change and how it is evaluated as being appropriate or consistent or not. But one of the things that I take home from this seminar and listening to Tara's talk is that there might be an age cohort effect across these different categories, because it might be that people who, you talked about retirees, and it might be that people who are aged in their 70s or 80s, sometimes people move at that stage to have a quiet life in a nice, pristine place, and so there might be a a kind of interaction, in a sense, between not just the relationship with the place, but also the stage of your life that you're in as well. And that might help to explain whether there is this additional desire to really preserve and conserve the way the place has been, and not have any kind of change, or not any marked kind of change. Maybe in that situation you do have that very close relationship between the type of relationship you have with the place and seeing it as something that would not change or shouldn't change. The stereotype of the NIMBY concept is also to some extent presuming that these are people who are against change. That is part of the stereotype. They are people who are against progressiveness. But of course that is the stereotype, so it's difficult to know whether there is much truth in that. But I don't think the different varieties are against change per se, but I think there might be, it's more the kind of change or the magnitude of change. But I do think there might well be something in terms of the age effect as well, and perhaps recognizing that people who move in their 50s might be different from people who move in their 70s, for example. Because as you said, if people's physical mobility changes, then the immediate environment becomes much more important. And I speak as somebody whose father turned 85 a few weeks ago. He's nearly blind, but he can manage his house incredibly well. But I don't think he could live anywhere else. So in that sense, he could not tolerate change in his immediate environment, I think, very easily at all.
No, that's fine.
So I think now the seminar is coming to the end. So thank you again, Tara and Patrick, for these presentations.